And we're here today to talk with scholar and writer Dan-el Padilla Peralta. He's a writer of the book Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League. He's currently a lecturer at Columbia University, and his focus is on the classics. For those of you who don't know, Law at the Margins is a web platform intended to raise issues on law and social justice. Monthly, we host these Google chats to bring together activists, academics on various issues on law and social justice. And today we're very excited to have Dan-el, not only to talk about his book, but also his piece around the immigration policies in Dominican Republic. And so the title of our talk today is around race, citizenship, and democracy. So thank you, Dan-el, for joining us. I want to let the listeners know that on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a Q&A box. So throughout this chat, please, I encourage you to send your questions to us. You can also tweet this chat. Please use the hashtag #LawAtMargins, and we will try to bring those questions to Dan-el. These chats are really primarily for each of you. So let's begin. Dan-el, I want to begin with the book. I want to encourage everyone to actually pick it up and read it. But so yes, I can have my own copy. And you know, big up to the public library. So it's already there, and I was very impressed. So those of us who are maybe economically challenged and don't have the means, you know, to buy the books that we love to buy, the public library is there as a source. So you write your story in terms of sounds like a sort of a rags to riches, undocumented version. You went to collegiate, or elite school, Princeton, Stanford, Oxford. Now you're at Columbia. And so in many ways, also you had a lot of opportunities and mentorship from Jeff, as well as Father Michael, and obviously your mother, which is the prime mentor in your life, it seems. How could the average undocumented youth, the 1.4 million, relate to this seemingly extraordinary story? So why don't we start with that, and maybe give the listeners a bit of a teaser of contours of your life story, if you want, and by answering.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be engaging in this conversation and to talk not only about the book, but also about the range of social issues the book hopes to intersect with, and that my writing elsewhere, specifically in the Guardian piece, hopes to take up as well. So just in terms of a quick recap of the book and its contents, in Undocumented, I give, as you mentioned, the rags to riches style account of how I, as an undocumented immigrant, coming to the United States from the Dominican Republic at the age of 4, made it in New York City with the guidance and help and inspiration of my mom, and over time several mentors along the way, to an elite private school, and from there to Princeton, Oxford, and Stanford. Now, in writing the book, I was worried that this rags to riches narrative would be taken as some kind of exemplification or vindication of these very conventional implantments of the American dream, according to which people would say, oh, well, he was upwardly mobile. See, any obstacle can be overcome if you just try hard at it. And I have several responses to this. So one of the issues that I studiously avoid overglossing in the book, but that I would hope that some readers would at least be alert to, is that there is an extraordinary amount of contingency involved in these outcomes. So the fact that I was lucky enough to receive all of these opportunities is no validation of this system of power and accreditation as it's conventionally configured. To paraphrase James Baldwin, whose essays I always return to, the fact that 1 or 2 people make it into the big time, however one puts it, does not mean that the system is functioning well. On the contrary, it may very well mean that the system is functioning terribly. The other issues that I hope to gesture at in the book is how we might push back against the conventional rags to riches story, right? So I would want the book to be open to critiques of the kind that you just floated. Why is it that there is such a preoccupation with plotting lives along this sort of trajectory of success as measured by, say, Ivy League attainment or going to elite schools and all that? I mean, what does that tell us about our own value system? Now, with specific respect to undocumented youth and other undocumented youth, I hope the book is able to foreground for them the importance of communities in their upbringing, right? So one of the most constitutive and driving features of my own development was precisely the sense of belonging that came with forming part of not one but numerous communities, and of meeting people at each of these communities who were willing to lavish extraordinary amounts of time on my own upbringing and care. And so that's a message I want to impart. But there are many others, which we'll get to in due course.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. In your book, you do sort of talk about your relationship to your brother, who, I don't want to spoil the ending, but doesn't go to an Ivy League, and you have a conversation about him around that, which speaks to not wanting to sort of reinforce sort of this notion that you should do it the way I'm doing it, or I'm sort of the exhibit A of immigrant success. But nonetheless, I think that you're right to sort of point out the potential hazards, right, of your narrative being used as, that look, if Dan-el can do it, then why can't others do it? Not just in terms of undocumented youth, but I also want to shift in terms of your racialization as a black man, because throughout your book you also identify as someone who not only is Dominican but is also black. So here's this other black man who is at Columbia, lecturer, classics, academic, successful, came from poverty. So why can't these other folks in the sort of low-income youth, why can't they do it? So what would be your response? You gave a response to the hazards of using it as an undocumented narrative, but I think you have also this other piece, which is that could be used against sort of, poor black youth, like, hey, there's no racism. Look, he's made it and he's gotten all of these prizes.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of different things that come to mind as I reflect on answers to this question. So one is the fact that in terms of its narrative and narratological structure, the book relies really heavily on these, on what, for lack of a better term, we could designate as white savior figures, right? So we have people like Jeff, Father Michael, Gary Simons of Pepper Prep. These are all, to really push against the characterization that is sort of externally on the surface made available in the book. These are all figures who in some way operate as white saviors, right? So there's several different ways one could approach this. One could say, well, I guess we were discussing just now, it takes a white savior figure to identify the one talented kid in the hood and really raise him out of that. But I think this is pernicious, right? And it's problematic for a whole host of reasons. One of the takeaways I hope the book leaves people with is not just that there's this sort of inspirational arc, but there's something very unsettling about the fact that, in fact, my success had to be conditioned on these kinds of interventions, and that there is also a problem in a system that validates itself by reference to these kinds of stories of intervention. And so now this gets us to the question of racialization, because when I refigure these characters in my life as white savior figures, I am drawing attention in the first instance to their race, right? And these sort of salvific narratives that hinge crucially on the intervention of white people is something that I would very much hope to challenge with how I present the book in a public forum. I cannot sort of overdetermine people's readings, which is why in the core of the book itself, I resisted my own temptation to supply annotation about these things. But that is a reading that I would hope to strive with and against in the public forum. The final point on racialization is tied to the question of sort of layability or movement from community to community and from setting to setting. Because I know as a staple of my everyday life that I am a fully racialized black man, and that I operate in all of these spaces where it may be possible to suspend for a moment the notion that I am a fully racialized black man, but reminders of this are provided to me daily. So it's impossible to exist in some kind of de-racialized or non- or post-racialized state. In the craft of the book, I tried to gesture at this without, again, over-determining or annotating such that people would see all of my cards on the table.
Right. No, I think there are a couple of things I just want to make sure that listeners really to highlight in what you said. One is that the focus around the the white saviors as opposed to actually the community interventions that led to your success. So the way in which we're reading your story, right? I mean, instead of putting the onus on you, you're putting this rags to riches stories. The reader is also putting that narrative on your life instead of seeing how, which I saw, the protagonist is really your mom. It's the constant. So here is this Latina woman, undocumented, as really the primary interventionist by staying, right, in terms of your educational success. Yet why is it that we see these other figures, male predominantly, as being, so I think that those two things that you mentioned, sort of how the reader, and you can't determine how the reader sees your story, but how you sort of push against that, I think is really important. Let's shift to this delving deeper in the conversation around race. In your book, you do reference, and I think you kind of answered that in some ways where you can't escape it, but you don't want to over-determine it. There were incidents when you were, I guess, a teenager, and there's a name calling of the Haitian booty. And I remember that time period where there was so much discrimination against Haitian Americans. So here you are, this racialized black man, but Dominican, and everyone's using this sort of derogatory statement around Haitians. The story of being darker than your brother, and then there were also, I think, dating stories around someone not wanting to date you because you are black. So like you said, the sort of race comes up, but there weren't times where maybe that I felt you were really exploring that. And maybe part of it is what you just said, which is, this is a memoir, this is not some scholarly piece on race, but maybe you can sort of speak to that. Is that an accurate reading? What were your intentions? And then beyond the book, what are sort of your thoughts around some of these issues, looking back?
So in the craft of the book, and this is something that we brought up earlier, I had to fight very hard against my determination to systematically interpret episodes in my life that in their aggregate concatenation and in their individual occurrence, I construed as embodying certain scripts of race, right? And this was sincerely one of the hardest things about writing the book, because it was difficult for me to develop a system that would allow me to fully foreground my sense of race at every step by developing emergent sense of how race conditioned responses and reactions to me. So, for example, one of the vignettes that I chose to leave in the book with a view to gesturing in that direction without, again, over-determining readings along these lines was the vignette of one of my classmates my senior year telling me that I'd gotten into Princeton because of affirmative action.
Right, that was
so that I chose to sort of keep in, not only because it sort of obviously fit into the arc of my senior year, and it was also very significant for me, but because I wanted it to set up a range of possible readings of my times in college that would at the very least be alert to the possibility of a racialization taking place behind the scenes or between the lines of my text, right? This sense that I've been interpolated as someone who for some reason didn't belong and only got to X and Y place because of race. I mean, this is something that I very much struggled with my freshman and sophomore years of college until I arrived at an essential sort of F this moment where I said, well, I'm going to be interpolated as such, and my response is simply to work as hard as possible. But this is not an adequate psychological solution either. And so trying to figure out what an appropriate strategy for maneuvering around this was something that occupied my energies at the time, only something that I could glancingly allude to in the construction of the book itself.
Right, and so in terms of, I think those instances are interesting in terms of where you sought to claim that racial identity, and then where you sought to let the, either the reader speak for itself, or maybe you intentionally not wanting to sort of give the annotation, as you say. You do the same thing around immigration. I think it took you sort of a while to sort of come out, so to speak, that you were not documented. Were the same considerations at play there? I mean, they were different. Are the sort of racialization conversation and claiming that identity sort of in a different, and the fears, right? I mean, you're not going to be deported, but there's other fears, right, of not being read as competent, deserving, and then versus sort of the immigrant identity. Where are they similar? Where are the fears of claiming those identities, and where are the sort of maybe possibilities for empowering of those identities?
Mm-hmm. That is a very meaty question. So I would say that one of the many issues that occupied me while writing some of the chapters was how to track own emergent sense of an intersectional identity, right? So one that acknowledged that in fact I was operating at the nexus of racialization scripts and undocumented scripts or migration scripts that were also racialized, right? I mean, so there's really this, and then hand in hand with that, there's there are other questions that we could sort of potentially pose about my inhabiting spaces of male privilege,
Yes.
so I mean this is something that you already alluded to with the question of dating, right? So how am I figuring race in context of dating? What does that say about my sensibilities as I was making my way through college and beyond, and the degree to which some of those perceptions that I developed in college and after were themselves the product of racial implotments that I and that it would take me years to think out or think around. But with specific regard to one of the questions you raised, one of the abiding preoccupations I've had in reflecting on the book after I finished writing it is, well, how do I think about my own sort of co-optation into racialized narratives, right? So how do I acknowledge that to some degree how I registered my experience as I was making my way through high school and college was always already racialized and always already illegalized in some respects. And this has been, again, one of the conundra that has taken me years to sort of get my mind fully around. Now, with the question of racialization and immigration and these two experiences as operating in effect in tandem, I realized that I was going to have to do more writing about this that extended beyond the book, which was one of the motivations for writing the Guardian piece, because once it sort of clicked for me that we needed to begin thinking about not just the Dominican Haiti experience, but really sort of globalized migratory flows as also operating and inflected by racialized and quite explicit, some of them less explicit but still pernicious, I realized I'm going to have to do a lot more writing about this. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to write a short piece and then write another longer piece later. When that piece will come out is anyone's guess.
Right. No, I think that's excellent. I think it's a great segue to talking about sort of the broader issue. I think that you also sort of mentioned that the gendered space, and for this conversation, we're not going to, you're happy. I'm happy if you want to sort of go down that road, sort of talk about how male privilege may have buffered you from some of those other identities, but the way in which you've been sort of negotiating all these identities, I think, is very clear in the book, and grappling with it. I think that's very key. So let's talk about sort of, let's shift from sort of the personal. I think your perspective as a racialized person, in terms of also the way in which the undocumented, not now, obviously you've adjusted your status, and then the gendered aspect of it, right? All of those pieces. How do we understand what's happening, or, looking at sort of Dominican Republic, your country of origin, what are your just reflections? I mean, some of it's in your piece, and then also in the United States. I mean, what are some of your preliminary thoughts around your personal experience and those identities?
So some of my thoughts are actually bound up with the nature of the scholarship I do, and this is, I'm sure, something we can talk about at greater length later. But in the case of the Dominican Republic, one of my as I mentioned in the memoir, I've been interested in part because of my mom for ages in the study of Dominican history, and in thinking about Dominican history in the sort of immediate and short term, as well as Dominican history in the long durée in relation to Caribbean history and patterns of Caribbean history more broadly, and global history. So one of the experiences I had that proved to be very formative for me, and that I do not mention in the book, but I have made the core of another project I'm working on, is that when I was a teenager, my mom would lead these church rosary prayer get-togethers at people's houses in the projects, in Polo Grounds and in the Charles Wrangell houses. And one day we visited the house of a Dominican friend of my mom's, and she had these books in Spanish on her shelf. I was starved for something to read at the time, and so I asked her if I could borrow two, and I borrowed those two. So the two were Joaquín Balaguer's Memorias de un Cortesano, and the Ángel del Rosario Pérez's La Exterminación Añorada. So these two books, I had no inkling at the time of my picking them off the shelf, were implicated in really deep, far-ranging, and highly racialized ideological projects. So in the case of Balaguer's memoirs, one of the things that he tries to dance around, but more or less sort of confronts explicitly, is his involvement with Trujillo, and all of its many ugly consequences, which Balaguer, of course, sort of dismisses out of hand. Right. In the case of La Exterminación Añorada, this text, which I found sort of mystifyingly incomprehensible when I picked it up as a 13-year-old, when I revisited it in my 20s, I realized that this was a product not only of the Trujillo ideological apparatus, but it was written by Trujillo's apparatchik. And the argument of this book was that Dominicans should essentially gird themselves to exterminate Haitians. And part of the reason for that was, according to Rosario Pérez, the Dominican Republic had a civilizing function. This is where these sort of colonial mission civilisatrice type discourses really show themselves to have infiltrated a particular domain of the Dominican elite intellectual consciousness, not only of Trujillo's time, but after. And so it was in reading these books that I began to come to grips with how, in fact, my own sort of personal experience of being not only sort of Dominican in some nationalized way, but more specifically a black, dark-skinned Dominican, intersected with these broader historical currents that informed the contemporary culture and cultural dynamics of the Dominican Republic.
Wow, that you read that at 13, Balaguer.
Well, not at 13. I mean, I had to sort of grow into that. You know?
But I think that that I think is really important in terms of the conscious efforts creating a racialized citizenship, the role of the state. And so I want to, and I think we hadn't sort of mentioned this to those who are listening, is your background in the classics, and so, you know, maybe if you can sort of bring that in, you know, just one as a personal level, you know, now I think I kind of understand why you were drawn to the classics at the younger age, because I think maybe in your mind all of these sort of texts are trying to sort of find some interrelation. It's not as clear in the book. It just seems like, you know, this is a very precocious boy who loves Greek mythology and gravitates towards it, but that there was actually a deeper reasoning for your being drawn to it. Maybe you can kind of bring in your scholarship, at least your interest in the classics, and how does that sort of relate to the conversation we're having now around race and migration?
So specifically on the subject of my sort of the reasons why I sort of became interested in classics, one of the things about the book that caused me considerable grief was my back and forth with my editors over just how much material drawn from my early encounters with the classics should go into the book, because in a way, one of the many things that drew me to the classics was not just the sort of linguistic aspect, right? The idea that you could learn these languages, you could develop a kind of mastery of these languages, but it was also the interface with the texts that were written in these languages that really appealed to my teenage nerdy self in very powerful ways. These texts gave me still another vocabulary with which I might calibrate my sense of self, develop an understanding of what different modes of alterity were, and crucially also sort of broaden the range of my empathy, although, as I try to gesture at in the book, when I was a teenager, I was really, as many teenagers tend to be, the sort of incredibly, in terms of emotional range, very limited person. It took me a while to begin developing a sort of encompassing sense, not just of empathy, but of my obligations to other people. But more than in connection with the classics and how they shaped my orientation towards a whole host of sort of contemporary issues. One of the aspects of the classics that really seized me when I was in college is that the field requires mastery of not only of several different kinds of methodologies, but several different kinds of, for lack of a better term, content domains, right? So it's not only that you have to know the languages, although it really does help to have a good command of the languages. It's also that you have to come to grips with material culture. It's also that you have to think, if you're in the historical fields, about periodization, about the craft of writing history. And crucially, and this now gets us to the point that one of your questions was headed to, how the writing of history is in itself an ideologically inflected exercise. And so I think about this specifically with respect to, for example, contemporary debates about the origins of democracy, right? So one of the great ancient historians of the 20th century, Moses Finley, made an argument that struck some of his contemporaries and has since struck some of those who have critiqued him as difficult to swallow. He argued that, in fact, Greek democracy and slavery were bound up in a condition of mutual dependence, essentially. So you needed slaves in order to have Greek democracy. And so in thinking about developments in democratic theory since then, one of the things that I've become most attuned to and most preoccupied with is how practices of democratic theory and how political theory more generally writes out or effaces the existence of these others who are systematically subordinated in order to allow for the promotion of certain ideas of democracy. And I couldn't help but seeing how that was relevant to my own experiences as an undocumented immigrant. It was inescapable.
Right, no, I think that's exactly what that's part of the contradictions in terms of those of us who are not scholars but are familiar, and oftentimes the benchmark of American modern democracy is Greek democracy, right? And U.S. history has a similar, obviously, you talked about Dominican history and state and race, but this analogy could be placed in terms of the United States. So let's delve deeper into the comparison. You do that in your article, but you suggest that the Dominican Republic has inherited the worst of U.S. policy, at least in the title of it. But it seems that Dominican, at least from Balaguer and the history, had already been charted on this path of racializing and making a distinction of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And whether it's influenced by the racism and slavery at the time of the United States is, a different question. But can we tease out some comparisons of migration policy that you've experienced in the United States and what you're seeing currently in the Dominican Republic?
So I have the good fortune at Columbia Society of Fellows of having as one of my colleagues in the society a specialist in U.S. immigration policy, and his research focuses, his name is Hide Irota. His research focuses on specifically the 1800s and the development of an apparatus for deporting Irish immigrants. And so he's very willing always to sort of talk to me about and give lectures here about how this apparatus sort of slowly coalesces. Now, when I think about comparing the Dominican Republic to the U.S. and comparing their respective migratory systems, there are two questions that come to mind. and both of them are inflected by conversations I've had, not just with Hide, but with other experts on the history of immigration. The first is, when precisely do we date the link between U.S. imperial intervention in the Dominican Republic and the Dominican Republic's development of nation-state apparatuses, including, of course, a migratory policy, right?
Right.
So, of course, one could start with Balaguer. One could go before that, right? One can talk about the U.S. occupation of DR and Haiti.
Yes.
One can go back to the 1800s and talk about the sort of failed attempts at annexing the Dominican Republic, and hand in hand with that, the engagements of Dominican leaders with Spain in an effort to have Spain annex the Dominican Republic again, which of course happened for a short period of time. So when we write these narratives, we do have to think about these multiple points of intersection between the hegemon and the non-hegemonic power, with particular attention to the racialization of migratory policies. I would say that there are a couple of sort of codependent and, in fact, parallel developments that we have to be sensitive to. One is the fact that whiteness itself, as many historians have shown us, has been constituted, especially in the 1800s and continuing into the 1900s, by continuous triangulation and delineation of specific subcategories of whiteness. So in the U.S., this famously takes the form of, for example, the niggerizing of Irish people, which is also like a staple of British imperialist discourses of race. But all of that, in the longer term, does in fact then percolate and in fact infiltrates conversations about independence and nationalism that are taking place in places like the Dominican Republic. So we have to think about a global history of these efforts in which the U.S. and DR are sort of a mesh, but they're clearly not the only agents. We happen to see different developments unfolding at different points of time. They reflect the same underlying general socioeconomic and ideological structures.
You know, and that's why it's great to talk to someone who's a political theorist, to sort of see the linkages through, you know, in terms of the state, imperial interventions as a role in terms of the racialization. So I want to thank you for that. I want to, at this point, we ask those who are listening if they want to ask questions to either tweet Law at the Margins. You can use a Q&A feature. I want to slowly, you know, sort of wind down and kind of come to some conclusions. I know that you are extremely busy, and I really appreciate this conversation that we're having. So let's. I want to sort of speak to kind of maybe the work that's happening now, the organizing, protecting Haitian rights, or at least Dominicans of Haitian ancestry in Dominican Republic, and the revocation of the citizenship, and it was made retroactive. And I think in that way, the historical piece that you are asking us to be sensitive to, right? The history is being used both ways, right? I mean, the history is being used as to say that, well, we were colonized by Haiti, this sort of, you know, perverse switch, which is interesting that I've heard, and so then there's the sort of economic narrative that's used in the United States. They're, you know, the border, they're taking over, or they're not authentically, they're not real Dominicans. So there are all of these ways in which they're excluded from citizenship, which is ironic because then you also see a lot of Dominican Americans here really struggle with this issue and have not been as vocal as I thought that they would be, given their relationship to immigration here, and the mass deportation also, because for a whole host of reasons, which is a whole other conversation. And it just seems the way in which, you know, we're critiquing U.S. immigration policy, we meaning maybe Dominican diasporic community, yet maybe a little bit tempered in their critique of the Dominican Republic now. So again, a lot of stuff, because I think there's a lot of issues packed up in here. But, you know, address the parts that you would like, but, you know, maybe the historical, the rhetorical that's being used as a way to exclude, and, you know, maybe some thoughts on, like, you know, what's happening kind of contemporary.
So I see one of my obligations as a historian to press back against the idea that we can craft or elaborate historical narratives that are innocent, right? And so this is where I think some of the historiographic and rhetorical discourses of Dominicans and Dominican Americans who have expressed either sort of tacit or explicit support of the immigration policy needs to be reoriented and reimagined. So for people who would, for example, say, and there were people who made these comments in response to the Guardian piece or who have written about this elsewhere, who would say things like, well, Haiti colonized us. I mean, so an obvious question to pose back to that is, first of all, what does it mean to say this precisely? And why start with that? I mean, so like no beginning is innocent either. So
Right.
why not actually think about the emergence of and not only the colonization of Hispaniola, but also thinking about the range of socioeconomic extractive procedures that over time generated two states that were nonetheless engaged in very hybridized sociocultural relations with each other. Right. So when someone poses the question, or someone makes the statement, Haiti colonized the Dominican Republic, there's also a second-order logic there that needs to be interrogated, and that is you are presuming that Haiti and the Dominican Republic exist in a kind of metaphysics of singularity according to which they already always were two independent, fully formed, fully autonomous states. But the answer to that from the historical record, and the answer that we can generate by more systemic interrogation of the historical record, is far more complicated. In the same way one could sort of pose these questions to other aspects of the narrative that have been sort of developed and promoted in a range of Dominican publications back on the island. So I've read all of these op-eds that, for example, say Dominicans aren't racist, right? And in fact, the Dominican Republic's president came out swinging last week in a speech and said, oh, with our history of cultural hybridity, how could we be racist? Except he didn't use cultural hybridity. He said, with our history of mestizaje, how can we be racist? Right? So now, there are a lot of things that could be said about these kinds of remarks, but the one that I'll limit myself to elaborating for the time being is this notion of institutionalized and socio-legally perpetuated racism that I think Dominicans, in agreement with the immigration policy, have been very loath to take on board. So I could care less whether any individual Dominican is racist. That is not interesting to me as an intellectual issue or fundamentally as an ethical issue. The question is whether there are structures of power and institutions through which various forms of systemic oppression are perpetuated. And if these systems exist, then guess what? And they result in racialized outcomes, then there is racism. This is like fairly straightforward. So these are the kinds of rejoinders one, I think, should be making to these kinds of rhetorical and ultimately imperializing discourses.
Well, thank you. So we're actually sort of winding down to, you do these chats in a 30-minute mark. If folks have any last question, I do have one question, which I think you sort of answered, but I will pose it, and we can sort of conclude. Which is, how does your sort of knowledge or scholarship help us to inform our, activist sort of agenda? And I think it relates to, one of the questions also that I had, posed to you, which is very similar, which is, as a scholar who is personally impacted and benefited from immigration activism, how do you sort of bring both of these experiences to the present activism? Like, what are some thoughts, what could, the people who are listening to these chats are primarily, organizers, legal activists who are trying to sort of understand history and the scholarship and the framing which you do provide. What should they take away from what you're saying in thinking through what are sort of next steps?
So a simple wrap-up answer, because this is something that I would love to spend the whole 30 more minutes discussing, is that in thinking about our sort of historical knowledge, activists should encourage themselves, encourage each other to very rigorously interrogate the frames of that historical knowledge. So whenever any kind of historical fact is adduced, in conversations about X or Y policy, or the need to undertake X or Y. One of the questions that we should all be asking ourselves is, what is the utility of that historical fact for our discourse? And why is it that we have chosen this fact? Why have we constituted this fact or range of facts or set of historical testimonia as dispositive for our conversations about what to do or how to do it? Right? And so I see the use of the historical record as very locked into processes of continuous interrogation and reflection. We have to be critical of history because in a sense we are continuously making history. So there is no way of hermetically sealing off the past from the present. I mean, the past has become and remains constituted as our present because we are always locked into these discourses with our antecedents and antecessors. So that is my recommendation.
And then you sort of said that in the way in which currently understanding of Dominican history, U.S. history, is informing the current policy, right, in terms of excluding. So I think that there's actually a very concrete example in the way in which this is being utilized. Similarly, in the United States, the exclusion or around immigration, the obsession with the border, all of those things of how we even look at immigration history, right? How we look at race is informing current immigration policy. Do you have any? I do want to give you an opportunity because I know you've been active around immigration activism, and so with the Dreamers. So, are there things that you would like folks to know about that you're involved in? This is sort of my call to action to folks who are listening with respect to United States, and then are there organizing happening with respect to Dominican Republic, maybe in the diaspora community or in Dominican Republic that you think that people should be sort of plugged into and involved?
So first, shout out to organizations that have advocated and continue to advocate for Dreamers and all immigrants. I will be doing a short interview with United We Stay on Friday, and so this is an organization that people, if they haven't read about, should learn more about. Define American and the whole range of projects that have been shepherded by Jose Antonio Vargas. So very much worth people's time and energy. Jose Antonio Vargas is an inspirational figure on many fronts. In terms of work in the Dominican Republic, about 2 months ago, my parents were in the Dominican Republic, and my mom became involved with this initiative at one of the local churches in where she lives in Moca to bring food and humanitarian aid to Haitians on the border, Haitian communities on the border. Oh. And so I would encourage people to think about and do work on not only sort of efforts being organized in New York City and in the diaspora, but also to link up with Dominicans who are there and who are trying to get aid to these communities, which are filling up with people who are fleeing, and to, if at the very least they can't sort of volunteer their bodies, at least volunteer financial resources and support. So those are my send-off suggestions.
Great, excellent. So on the group that you mentioned, providing humanitarian aid in Dominican Republic, if you could provide that information, I will share that with folks on the Facebook event page. I'll also share Define American, other links. So I think that making it easier for people to connect. So if you could, maybe your mother's organization. So I want to, again, I think we're ambitious in terms of the topics that we wanted to raise, but I think that your memoir, your scholarship, and now speaking to you sort of raise really things that we should all be thinking about. And I want to thank you for your time. I hope that maybe as we progress, and I want to keep our focus on sort of migration, but global migration, as you put it, and to have you come back and to talk about sort of any of these strands. So I want to thank you, and again, I want to thank Albert Garcia, who is a social media consultant hosting these chats, and to let folks know, August 5th, we will have a second part of the series on Dominican Republic, which will focus a little bit more on the activism that is happening in the Dominican diaspora and also Haitian diaspora together, to deal with the citizenship issue. So thank you, and take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for having me.